Chosen one. The greatest trick is not vanishing. It is standing right in front of people and remaining completely unseen. Take a moment to think about that. Entire empires have fallen, not because an enemy battered down their gates, but because the threat was already inside, moving quietly and wearing a perfectly ordinary face. That is the story of your life. You have been hiding in plain sight. It was not because you were weak, but because you operated far above their radar. Most people only process what they are specifically trained to see. Psychologists refer to this as inattentional blindness, meaning you can stare directly at something and completely miss it if your brain does not consider it important. That is exactly how they missed you. They assumed they knew you. They believed you were predictable and safe to ignore. All the while you were taking notes, building your resilience, and quietly stacking your strength like hidden explosives, just waiting for the right spark. The part that will truly sting them is that you never even tried to hide. You were right there at the social gatherings, at the workplace, and at the family functions. You sat at the back of the room while they brushed you off. You laughed at their tired jokes, ate the same meals, and nodded along to the same gossip. Yet, you were carrying dimensions of power they could not have comprehended even if you handed them an instruction manual. It is beyond ironic. It is poetic justice. They never saw you coming, not because you were invisible, but because they were far too distracted looking for the wrong kind of threat. When the curtain finally lifts and they realize who you are and the weight of what you carry, their shock will feel less like a surprise and more like a betrayal. The truth was staring them in the face the entire time. Let us break down exactly why hiding in plain sight was never a weakness, but the most divine strategy you could have ever experienced. Number one, you were not invisible. They were blind. This is a difficult reality for people to accept. They love to believe they are highly observant, sharp, and excellent at reading others. However, most only notice what aligns with their own shallow expectations. They are conditioned to spot loud personalities, flashy displays, and obvious markers of authority. Anything that falls outside that narrow perspective gets completely overlooked. That is precisely why they failed to see the real you. Their blindness had nothing to do with your lack of presence. It had everything to do with their lack of depth. They assumed you were ordinary because their definition of extraordinary has always been superficial. To them, social status equals importance, noise equals authority, and material possessions equal success. Because you did not parade those things around, they wrote you off. They could not recognize a wisdom that does not brag. They did not understand a strength that refuses to put on a show. They failed to realize that true resilience often wears the simple mask of an ordinary life. That is not your failure. It is their blindness. Their lack of vision functioned like a filter. Every time you appeared, they filtered out the most crucial details. They ignored how you maintained quiet composure while others spiraled into panic. They overlooked how you absorbed betrayal without letting it turn you bitter. They completely missed that your discernment was sharper than a knife, allowing you to see right through their lies without ever announcing it. It was all right there in the open, but their eyes were simply not trained to catch it. They only saw what they wanted to see, and by doing so, they betrayed themselves far more than they ever betrayed you. The beauty of their blindness is that it handed you absolute freedom. You were given the space to grow, to heal, and to transform without any interference. They underestimated you so severely that they left you completely alone in the very areas they should have been watching closely. That gave you the room to build in silence, gathering the tools and inner strength that now make you entirely untouchable. Their ignorance was not just foolishness. It was a layer of protection you never even had to ask for. When they finally open their eyes, it will burn, because they will realize you were always right there, carrying a depth they could never possibly measure. You did not have to disappear to stay hidden. They blinded themselves by refusing to look past the surface. Number 2, you mastered the art of normalcy. As camouflage, that was your absolute genius. You never tried to outshine anyone. You did not beg for recognition, and you certainly did not perform for their approval. You figured out how to walk among them without triggering any alarms, how to exist in their world without putting your full depth on display. While everyone else was exhausting themselves competing for attention, you were busy perfecting the art of being invisible in plain sight. You allowed them to believe you were average, harmless, and completely unremarkable. Hidden inside that false sense of security, their underestimation of you pushed you right into a powerful silence. Normalcy became your ultimate shield. You slipped into conversations without ever exposing the vast amount of knowledge you really held. You carried yourself in a way that never sparked envy or suspicion. You dressed like them, spoke like them, and moved like them, just enough so their radar would skip right past you. They were far too consumed with measuring people by outward appearances and loud behavior to realize that the quiet, ordinary person in the corner was the most dangerous kind of extraordinary, the kind that never feels the need to prove itself. This camouflage was never about making yourself small. It was pure strategy. You figured out early on that revealing your potential too soon only attracts the wrong kind of energy. It invites jealousy, sabotage, and pointless battles long before you are ready to fight them. So you let them misread you. You let them form their incorrect assumptions. You let them believe they had you entirely figured out. Behind the scenes, you were gathering your strength, stacking up silent victories, and maturing into a version of yourself they could never possibly prepare for. What makes this so incredible is that you did not just fool them, you actively trained yourself. By hiding in plain sight, you cultivated deep patience. You forged incredible discipline. You learned how to exist without craving outside validation. That level of preparation is absolutely priceless, because when your moment arrives, you do not just show up, you arrive completely unshakable. When they finally truly see you, it will feel like a betrayal to them. They will wonder how you could stand right beside them, looking so painfully ordinary, while secretly carrying such an extraordinary destiny. They will try to call it deception, but it was actually protection. You never tricked them. They tricked themselves by confusing being normal with being insignificant. By the time they figure out what was really happening, your camouflage will have already done its job. You will have emerged, leaving them stunned and asking how they never saw you coming. Number 3, they confused your stillness with weakness. That was their most fatal mistake. People often assume that if you are not being loud, constantly trying to prove yourself, or showing off, you must not have much value to offer. They link constant movement with real power, completely forgetting that true power rarely feels the need to announce itself. You were not still because you were stuck. You were still because you were calculating every move. You were carefully watching, absorbing, and discerning while everyone else was rushing around begging to be noticed. Your incredible restraint unsettled them, even if they refused to admit it out loud. They mistook your quietness for passivity, failing to realize it was the silence of someone who understood that perfect timing always beats loud noise. While they were scrambling to show off the little they possessed, you were conserving your energy and pouring it into things they could not even see. Things like immense growth, deep wisdom, and unbreakable inner stability. They assumed you were not moving at all, but the reality is you were just moving differently. You were not chasing, you were preparing. The real danger of them misreading your stillness is that it handed them a completely false sense of superiority. They convinced themselves you were beneath them, assuming you lacked the drive or the strength to ever climb higher. Because of that, they exposed themselves freely whenever you were around. They showed you their strategies, their glaring weaknesses, and their foolish illusions. They underestimated you so deeply that they practically handed you the exact blueprint for their own downfall. That is exactly what happens when insecure people mistake patience for powerlessness. They put all their cards on the table while you are still sitting there calmly, completely collected. What they failed to realize is that absolute stillness sharpens your perception. By refusing to rush, you noticed patterns they were completely blind to. You caught the hidden motives behind their words, the glaring inconsistencies in their actions, and the deep cracks in their fake confidence. While they thought you were doing absolutely nothing, you were gathering priceless insight they could never afford to buy. Now, when you finally make your move, your actions are never scattered. They are precise, highly deliberate, and entirely impossible to undo. By the time they realize your stillness was actually raw strength, it will be far too late. The exact version of you they brushed off as weak was the very version actively preparing to outgrow them completely. You did not lose anything by waiting. You won by simply letting them expose themselves. Their biggest error was believing your silence meant you had surrendered. In reality, it was just the terrifying calm before a storm they never saw coming. Number 4, they expected noise, not precision. That is precisely why they completely miscalculated your trajectory. In their shallow world, power is usually confused with whoever can yell the loudest, whoever can steal the spotlight the fastest, or whoever can dominate a room with pure ego. They have been conditioned to view arrogance as influence, to measure strength by dramatic theatrics, and to only recognize ambition when it is dressed up in heavy exaggeration. You, however, shattered that entire formula without even breaking a sweat. You did not arrive making noise. You arrived with deadly accuracy. Your moves were never scattered or fueled by desperation. They were exact, sharp, and executed with a level of intense focus they had no idea how to interpret. Because you did not announce your presence with arrogance, they foolishly assumed you had nothing worth announcing. They hunted for signs of insecurity they could exploit, or signs of desperation they could make fun of. But you refused to give them anything. Instead, you operated like a master surgeon, deliberate, incredibly steady, and virtually invisible until the final impact was completely irreversible. By the time they finally caught on to what you were actively building, it was no longer in the early stages where they could easily sabotage it. It was completely finished, firmly sealed, and sitting far beyond their reach. Your precision completely robbed them of the chance to interfere. That is what rattled them to their core. They could not track your movements. They were fully prepared for the kind of competition they were used to. People who bragged endlessly, people who begged for scraps, people who fought loudly just to be recognized. But your method was quiet, calculated strategy, not clumsy, desperate noise. Every single choice you made had deep intention. Every step was incredibly layered, and every pause was perfectly calculated. They assumed you were just inactive, when in reality you were fiercely disciplined. The great irony is that precision completely exposes how weak noise truly is. While they burned all their energy just trying to be seen, you saved your energy to produce actual results. When those results finally materialized, they could not deny them, no matter how hard they tried to minimize your presence. That is the undeniable power of precision. It leaves absolutely no room for debate. Noise can easily be ignored or mocked, but precision delivers concrete outcomes that speak entirely for themselves. So when they try to claim they never saw you coming, it is not the whole truth. They saw something, but because it was not screaming for attention, they dismissed it entirely. They underestimated the rare kind of strength that never begs to be noticed. By the time they finally woke up to the force you carry, Your incredible precision had already rewritten the entire game. Number 5. Your humanity became your cloak. You wore your humanity like a suit of armor, and they never even realized it was a highly effective weapon. While everyone else was busy polishing a cold, untouchable image to intimidate others, you were brave enough to let your rough edges show. You let them see the scars, the occasional doubts, and the small, honest admissions that you were not entirely perfect. To their untrained eyes, that openness looked exactly like vulnerability, so they leaned in closely, fully ready to exploit it. What they had no way of knowing is that every honest fracture you revealed was a deliberate move to completely disarm them. By being plainly human, you forced them to lower their guard, allowing you to move easily into spaces where heavy armor would have only kept you locked out. Your visible flaws successfully distracted them from the things that truly mattered. Things like your massive capacity to endure, your incredibly quiet moral backbone, and the daily habits that kept you solidly grounded. They focused entirely on the story of your wounds, instead of paying attention to the heavy work you were doing to forge those wounds into powerful tools. Their eager urge to label you as broken or overly emotional meant they never bothered to look for the massive fire you were quietly feeding deep inside. They wrongly assumed that people who wear their pain openly do not have what it takes to rebuild kingdoms. That massive misjudgment gave you the perfect cover to build your kingdom in absolute peace. There is a massive tactical advantage to simply being human in a world that is deeply allergic to authenticity. When you admitted you were exhausted, they quickly dismissed you. When you admitted you were afraid, they completely discounted your massive courage. Those dismissive reactions allowed you to practice deep resilience without an audience of spectators. You did not have to constantly fight off the challengers who would have surely shown up if you had advertised yourself as invulnerable. Instead, you were able to practice intense repair, deep humility, and genuine strength in absolute privacy. You built the kind of strength that actually holds firm under crushing pressure instead of cracking just for show. Being openly ordinary completely rewired their expectations. People usually only prepare for enemies who look exactly like traditional threats, polished, obnoxiously loud, and starving for status. You were none of those things. You were just a neighbor, a coworker, someone who easily made room for others without ever demanding to sit on a throne. Because they never expected absolute danger to come wrapped in warm empathy, they never built a single defense against it. Your genuine warmth became your perfect camouflage. Your raw authenticity became your secret pass to move through their ranks completely unnoticed. When the day finally arrived that your incredible depth could no longer be ignored, their pure shock was the ultimate proof of how flawless your strategy had been. They tried to accuse you of deception, acting as though true humility was some kind of dirty trick. The reality was much simpler and far more dangerous to them. You used your humanity not to simply blend in and apologize for your existence, but to quietly incubate a completely unstoppable version of yourself. Their total failure to comprehend that was the very last advantage they would ever hold over you. Number 6, they only recognize threats that imitate them. That is exactly why you slipped right past their defenses without a single ounce of resistance. Their entire system of judging others is completely built on comparison. They measure a person's worth by who is the loudest, who is the flashiest, and who is scrambling up the exact same ladder they are on. Their internal radar is strictly tuned to detect cheap replicas of themselves, people chasing the exact same empty validation, fighting fiercely for the exact same plastic trophies, or desperately clawing at the exact same pathetic crumbs. You did not mirror a single one of those behaviors. Because of that, in their minds, you did not even exist as a real competitor. You were never actually invisible. You were just completely unrecognizable to a shallow mindset that only knows how to respect its own exact reflection. The beautiful irony is that their incredibly limited vision turned out to be your greatest possible advantage. By refusing to move the way they moved, you entirely bypassed all of their suspicions. They were so consumed with battling each other for cheap recognition that they never once considered that someone standing completely outside their little battlefield could come in and redefine the entire arena. Their fatal mistake was believing that true danger only arrives dressed in highly familiar clothing. In reality, the absolute greatest threat is always the one who is playing a completely different game. The one who is quietly rewriting all the rules while everyone else is still desperately trying to memorize the old ones. You were never chasing their crumbs, so you never got stuck in their toxic cycle of endless scarcity. You were never trying to prove your worth with loud noise, so they could never trap you in their shallow, petty rivalries. You were never measuring your own success by their broken yardstick, so they could never manage to discredit you with their empty judgments. The absolute truth is that you were already operating on a frequency they could not even begin to hear. That is exactly why they overlooked you so easily. They simply did not possess the necessary equipment to pick up on the powerful signal you were transmitting. When a person is completely locked into viewing imitation as the only valid measure of power, true originality just looks like a whole lot of nothing to them. They could not possibly grasp your total detachment from their childish games, so they quickly wrote you off as entirely irrelevant. Yet, it was inside that exact detachment that your immense strength rapidly multiplied. While they were busy fighting over tiny positions in a rigged system designed to consume them, you were quietly creating a position that absolutely never required their permission or approval. That is why, when you finally emerged, it felt to them like a massive sudden invasion. It was never sudden at all. You had been diligently building the entire time, just safely outside their highly limited frame of vision. Their complete inability to recognize you was never proof that you were weak. It was undeniable proof that they were blind. Now, forced to face the harsh reality that the very person they ignored is the one holding all the true power, they have no choice but to admit the truth. Imitation might help them win their incredibly small games, but true innovation comes in and rewrites the entire board. Number 7, you wore familiarity like a mask. It worked so flawlessly that absolutely no one ever bothered to look any deeper. You never even needed to invent some fake, polished version of yourself. You simply allowed the unpolished, heavily unfinished parts of your life to stand right out in the open. Your family thought they had you perfectly mapped out because they had watched you stumble in the past. Your friends firmly believed they had you cornered because they knew all about your past habits, your deep insecurities, and your previous mistakes. They foolishly mistook simple access for genuine understanding. They really thought that just being near you meant they had completely mastered exactly who you were. But what they were actually studying was just a rough draft, not the final, brilliant manuscript. That mask of deep familiarity was incredibly powerful because it never raised a single red flag. You seamlessly blended right into their outdated memory of you, fading perfectly into the rigid narrative they had constructed in their own minds. They brushed it off, saying that is just how you are, and they happily left it at that. They never once thought you were evolving because they were entirely too busy reliving a past version of you that had already ceased to exist. They were not necessarily wrong about who you used to be, but they were entirely blind to who you were rapidly becoming. That specific blindness handed you the perfect, uninterrupted room to grow. What they failed to realize is that pure familiarity can often be the absolute best cover. People very rarely take the time to investigate something that feels entirely predictable. They completely stopped questioning your moves because they honestly believed the story they had written about you was already finished. But while they were comfortably resting in their lazy assumptions, you were sharpening your mind, building your foundation, and deeply transforming right beneath the surface. The older version of you that they felt they knew simply became a clever decoy, while the highly refined version of you matured completely in silence. This is exactly why the shock is hitting so incredibly hard right now. They simply cannot reconcile the old familiar you with the incredibly powerful person standing right in front of them today. They feel deeply betrayed, acting as if you deliberately hid something malicious from them, when in absolute reality, you just grew up. You did not play a trick on them. They played a trick on themselves by fully believing that immense growth was somehow impossible for you. They wore their absolute certainty like a heavy suit of armor, and it left them completely and totally exposed when you finally outgrew their tiny version of your identity. The mask of familiarity was never an intentional lie. It was simply the temporary shadow cast while the brilliant light of your true, authentic self was still forming. Now that you have confidently stepped into your deep refinement, their comfortable illusion has been entirely shattered. The very people who once loudly swore they had you completely figured out are now left entirely stunned, finally realizing that the ordinary face they so easily dismissed was nothing but a temporary cover for someone truly extraordinary. Number 8. They mistook your detours for defeats. That is exactly where they misread your entire story. Every single time life suddenly redirected you, every time heavy doors slammed closed in your face, every time you went completely quiet, they threw a celebration way too early. They firmly believed that a temporary pause meant the absolute end, that a painful loss meant a total collapse, and that your deep stillness meant you simply had absolutely nothing left to give. They failed to realize that divine detours are never dead ends. They are powerful recalibrations. The exact moments they so quickly labeled as total failures were the very same moments life was actively using to reroute you into perfect alignment with something massively bigger than anything they could ever possibly imagine. To their limited minds, your painful setbacks were absolute proof that their harsh predictions were right. They boldly claimed you would never rise, and when you momentarily stumbled, they quickly pointed and nodded aggressively, as if their dark prophecy had just been fulfilled. What they were entirely blind to was that stumbling directly forced you to quickly adjust your steps, to highly strengthen your solid footing, and to pay close attention in profound ways that easy success never could have possibly taught you. While they were busy laughing at your pain, you were quietly learning. While they were aggressively gossiping, you were steadily gathering powerful tools. Every single so-called crushing defeat was actively carving into you a level of deep wisdom they do not even possess the mental capacity to value. The absolute brilliance of sudden detours is that they perfectly shield you. If your path to greatness had been far too direct and entirely too visible, they absolutely would have interfered, actively sabotaged your progress, or deeply plotted against your success. But when life suddenly rerouted you, it threw them entirely off your scent. They honestly thought you had been permanently removed from the race altogether, never once realizing you were simply being gently escorted into a completely different lane where their toxic interference could never possibly touch you. Their massive miscalculation instantly became your ultimate protection. Their deep arrogance perfectly became your absolute cover. When you finally came back significantly stronger, incredibly sharper, and massively more grounded, it made absolutely no sense to their limited minds. They were entirely certain you had been utterly defeated, but what actually happened was that you had been heavily refined. Those painful, quiet seasons handed you unbreakable resilience. Those harsh failures violently stripped away all your foolish illusions. Those frustrating delays actively taught you brilliant strategy. You absolutely did not return as the exact same person. You returned completely untouchable. Now their mass confusion is incredibly loud. They whisper among themselves, wondering how this could have possibly happened, asking if you were not completely finished. No, you were never finished. You were simply completely hidden in the powerful rerouting process, actively being rebuilt in profound ways they were never allowed to witness. They foolishly mistook the noisy silence of heavy construction for the sad silence of total ruin. Now that the massive structure of your incredible life stands incredibly tall, they are violently forced to face the absolute truth. Every single painful detour they happily celebrated as your permanent end was actually the exact path that made you completely unstoppable. Number 9, you were hidden by the banality of survival. That turned out to be your absolute greatest disguise. They smugly looked at the difficult jobs you worked and openly sneered at you. They harshly judged the rough neighborhoods you lived in, the simple clothes you wore, and the heavy struggles you constantly carried, and they quickly concluded that you were entirely insignificant. To their highly privileged minds, simple survival looked exactly like massive failure. They were entirely too blind to see that heavy survival was actually intense training. A deeply rigorous training that would soon give you profound layers of raw strength and deep wisdom they could never possibly afford to buy or easily fake. Every single mundane, highly overlooked detail of your painful life quickly became a crucial part of your heavy cloak, wrapping you up in such convincing ordinariness so completely that absolutely no one ever realized what immense power was actively being built deep inside you. The hard truth is that they never truly respect the brutal grind until it finally produces massive glory. They never place any real value on the exhausting late nights, the incredibly small paychecks, the worn hand-me-downs, the massive daily sacrifices, or the deep resilience it takes just to keep your head barely above water. They quickly dismiss all of it because it looks entirely unremarkable to them. But that is simply because they are far too shallow to ever recognize how much massive endurance is actively being forged right inside the burning fire of a deeply ordinary life. They foolishly mistook your daily survival for lazy stagnation, but it was exactly the opposite. It was the rock-solid foundation. Every single exhausting shift you worked while deeply tired, every single tight bill you desperately stretched to cover, every single painful rejection you quietly endured, all of it actively made you incredibly sharper. They openly mocked those heavy moments because they honestly believed that only glamorous, highly visible battles can ever produce true greatness. They entirely failed to understand that the incredibly quiet, heavy discipline of just surviving day to day actively builds something far more dangerous. Unshakable inner power. Raw survival violently forced you to quickly adapt, to brilliantly innovate, and to deeply stretch far beyond your normal limits. It was never glamorous, but it was highly effective. While they were entirely focused on polishing their fake appearances, you were deeply busy sharpening your harsh reality. What actively hid you so incredibly well was the simple fact that raw survival never looks like deep preparation to the highly judgmental outside eye. It just looks exactly like someone who is barely holding on by a tiny thread. But right beneath that highly convincing image, you are actively learning massive resourcefulness, deep patience, profound empathy, and brilliant strategy. Powerful qualities that absolutely cannot be bought with cheap privilege or quick shortcuts. That is exactly why, when the tables finally completely turn, you will firmly stand with a level of raw strength that seems entirely unfair to them. They will endlessly wonder how you manage to carry such deep wisdom, how you always remain completely steady under crushing pressure, and how you consistently find a clear way forward. They will never fully realize that those powerful answers were violently forged in the exact same seasons they so openly mocked. In the absolute end, raw survival never diminished your bright light. It perfectly disguised you. It heavily cloaked your massive rise in complete ordinariness so entirely that absolutely no one ever saw the massive greatness actively being sculpted. Now, as you boldly step fully forward, they will painfully realize that the simple life they so easily dismissed as entirely nothing special was the exact fertile soil where something absolutely extraordinary was deeply taking root. Number 10. They could not trace what had no pattern. Their entire limited way of sizing people up heavily depended on boring repetition, highly predictable habits, familiar old ruts, and the obvious telltale signs that easily let them map out a person's life and place their cheap bets. You entirely refused to be a simple graph they could easily read. You absolutely did not march to a boring drum that matched theirs, so all of their predictive models entirely failed. Where they eagerly expected boring repetition, you consistently offered brilliant variation. Where they aggressively looked for easy emotional triggers, you calmly offered deep discretion. That massive confusion quickly became your ultimate advantage. Because you never once acted for cheap applause or desperately tried to fit into their rigid script, you completely denied them all the usual data points they desperately needed. They absolutely could not pin you down to a rigid schedule or a predictable swagger. You quickly shifted exactly according to what the current moment strictly required, not according to what would simply make a highly entertaining story. That brilliant flexibility made you entirely impossible to exploit. Toxic people who constantly prey on others quickly learn predictable patterns and then heavily press those specific buttons. You absolutely left no consistent emotional buttons for them to press. You never handed them any cheap leverage, neatly wrapped in a predictable habit. Your massive unpredictability was never mindless chaos. It was a highly deliberate choice. You actively learned to quickly change your exact speed, your vocal tone, and your deep focus, depending entirely on what kept you the absolute safest and the most highly effective. That specifically meant your bitter opponents could never successfully set traps for you, because all traps heavily rely on baited, predictable expectations. Whenever they actively tried to strictly predict your exact behavior, they were desperately trying to read a script that absolutely did not belong to you. Their massive, unearned confidence quickly turned into a massive miscalculation. Their cheap strategies, which were entirely built on boring repetition, quickly collapsed whenever they were actively faced with someone who constantly moved by deep intent rather than by mindless routine. This brilliant strategy also perfectly protected your firm boundaries. Toxic people who strictly expect predictable patterns always assume there is deep vulnerability whenever that pattern suddenly breaks. They constantly confuse brilliant inconsistency with deep weakness. You heavily leveraged that highly foolish assumption. You kept them just comfortable enough to eagerly show their entire hand. Then, you quickly shifted far away from their rigid assumptions and simply let their massive exposure clearly stand entirely on its own. Their massive surprise was absolute proof of exactly how thoroughly they had counted on your boring repeatability. Firmly refusing to be easily profiled actively taught you another incredibly valuable habit: deep discretion. You quickly learned exactly which specific details to finally reveal and exactly which ones to permanently keep deeply hidden. You actively practiced being entirely opaque without ever actually being deceptive. That massive kind of restraint heavily frustrated the shallow people who desperately wanted incredibly easy narratives. It strictly forced them to either fully accept you entirely on your own terms or quickly reveal the massive limits of their own highly restricted imagination. Simply put, by firmly refusing to fit into their tiny mold, you absolutely did not create chaos just for the sake of chaos. You brilliantly created a powerful life they could absolutely never manipulate. Their rigid algorithms, which were entirely built for cheap clones and boring copies, massively failed against a true original. When the exact moment finally arrived and you boldly made your move, their massive shock was not just because you suddenly appeared. It was entirely because they had absolutely never been able to successfully sketch the rough outline of exactly who you would eventually become. Number 11. You were the answer sitting in their blind spot. They completely missed the real answer because they were aggressively looking in all the absolute wrong places. While they desperately chased flashy headlines, powerful allies, or massive obvious threats far beyond their immediate circle, the actual true solution stood completely quietly right at arm's length. Their frantic search was nothing but a cheap performance, loud, highly dramatic, and incredibly expensive. They desperately scoured highly distant networks, aggressively paid attention to incredibly glamorous rescues, and heavily trained their deep suspicion entirely on absolute strangers. That massive oversight left a massive blind spot where the highly practical, deeply patient, and fully present person could easily operate completely without any interruption. You were never completely hidden by vast geography. You were entirely hidden by their massive arrogance. The highly smug belief that whatever truly mattered absolutely had to arrive with massive fanfare or come from somewhere incredibly exotic. That deep arrogance made them entirely skip right over the glaringly obvious. They foolishly assumed their massive salvation would be a huge spectacle, so the quiet, everyday presence of absolute competence just looked exactly like boring background noise to them. Toxic family members easily dismissed the one person who always showed up and quietly fixed things entirely without drawing any cheap attention to themselves. Shallow coworkers completely ignored the highly reliable person who quietly solved massive problems simply because the easy fixes did not make the boring meetings any more interesting. Arrogant leaders completely overlooked the incredibly steady hand right within their own exact ranks, simply because they desperately wanted a highly dramatic champion to loudly validate their poor decisions. The very close proximity that absolutely should have made you incredibly visible instead made you entirely invisible, simply because they foolishly equated close proximity with boring familiarity, and therefore with total unimportance. Being the exact answer quietly sitting right in their massive blind spot gave you a massive tactical advantage. You instantly had direct, quiet access to exactly what they foolishly squandered, while constantly looking outward: deep relationships, vital context, massive patience, and perfect timing. You clearly saw all the tiny cracks long before they ever became massive chasms, simply because you were standing right there when the very first cracks formed. You deeply understood the highly complex dynamics of the exact place because you actively lived right inside them. Absolutely not as a passing tourist, but as someone who skillfully navigated the harsh daily realities. That massive insider knowledge let you quietly prepare brilliant solutions that absolutely could not be easily imported or cheaply faked. It let you instantly act with immense precision in exact moments when highly dramatic gestures would have only made things massively worse. When they finally truly noticed you, their massive reaction was a heavy mixture of deep disbelief and profound shame. They felt deeply betrayed by your close proximity. They loudly wondered how the exact answer could have possibly been standing so incredibly close while they were entirely blind to it. Their massive regret is incredibly loud right now, because it is vastly easier for them to loudly blame the entire world than to simply admit they completely overlooked exactly what was standing right in front of them. The absolute truth is, your powerful presence was absolutely never a cheap trick. You absolutely never had to loudly perform just to prove your massive capability. You simply quietly chose to just do the highly necessary work exactly where it strictly needed to be done, right in the highly quiet center of their massive chaos. That profound revelation deeply stings them because it completely reveals the massive, heavy cost of their own foolish blindness, massively wasted time, completely missed opportunities, and incredibly needless drama. Meanwhile, for you, simply being the exact answer quietly sitting right in their massive blind spot was absolutely never about deliberately withholding solid proof. It was always entirely about quietly working exactly where true impact actually matters, absolutely not where fragile ego desperately demands cheap applause. When your massive impact finally completely arrives, they will absolutely have nowhere left to look but deeply inward at the exact space they completely refuse to ever see. Number 12. They saw the vessel, never the volume. They quickly looked right at you and foolishly thought they had you entirely figured out. They strictly judged you entirely by the highly superficial surface, your current job title, your exact income, the simple clothes you wore, your basic background, the highly trivial things that could easily be quickly sized up. In their highly limited minds, you were incredibly small simply because the outer container looked completely ordinary. They absolutely never stopped to deeply consider exactly what was completely hidden inside, exactly what immense power you actively carried, exactly what massive gifts you had been given, and exactly what deep strength had been heavily cultivated entirely in deep silence. They completely confused the basic simplicity of the outer vessel with the actual true measure of its highly massive content. That exact massive miscalculation is exactly what completely destroyed them. Massive volume absolutely cannot be seen with just a quick glance. You absolutely do not just pour out deep wisdom, immense depth, and massive resilience in highly loud, flashy displays. You quietly carry it until the exact right moment strictly demands it. That is exactly why they completely failed to ever see you coming. They strictly expected a massive threat to loudly announce itself with massive size or cheap glamour, arriving with the exact kind of flashy packaging they would quickly recognize as highly powerful. They entirely failed to understand that the actual true measure of a person is absolutely never found in the cheap outer container, but exactly in the massive, heavy weight of exactly what they have powerfully survived, deeply learned, and fiercely carried directly forward. The simple vessel they so openly mocked was actually actively holding massive oceans they absolutely could not even begin to fathom. This massive blindness is incredibly common simply because shallow people are heavily trained to strictly evaluate deep worth entirely by cheap appearances. They desperately chased highly surface-level signals like cheap money, fake influence, and shallow recognition. When they quickly saw you, they simply ticked their completely shallow little boxes and quickly moved right along, completely dismissing you as entirely harmless, easily replaceable, and completely forgettable. What they absolutely did not account for was the truly immeasurable, massive force of your deep capacity. You clearly possessed a raw strength that absolutely was not cheaply bought, but heavily built. You carried deep knowledge that absolutely was not cheaply borrowed, but fiercely earned. You held a massive resilience that absolutely was not easily inherited, but violently fought for right in the deep silence of raw survival. Because of that, when your massive volume finally entirely spilled completely out, it absolutely was not just incremental, it was completely overwhelming. They absolutely could not understand exactly how someone they eagerly deemed so entirely ordinary could suddenly shake massive foundations, completely rewrite fixed outcomes, and powerfully rise incredibly high above absolutely every single tiny box they had aggressively tried to shove you in. Their massive shock was absolutely not just in your immense growth. It was heavily anchored in the profound realization that they had absolutely been standing right next to massive greatness the entire time, entirely blind, simply because they absolutely could not see past the simple vessel. That is the absolute deepest cruelty of their massive mistake. They were so entirely focused on strictly judging the tiny cup that they completely missed the massive ocean. They massively underestimated exactly what completely could not be easily measured with a simple, cheap glance. Now finally forcefully faced with the absolute reality of your truly massive capacity, they are violently forced to finally confront the absolute truth. The simple vessel they so quickly dismissed was actually actively carrying massively more than their completely shallow blind eyes could ever possibly begin to perceive. Number 13, you disguise power as process. You absolutely did not just explode loudly onto the scene or violently hand out massive manifestos. You quietly moved exactly like someone deeply committed to simply getting one highly small, totally necessary thing done right after another. Foolish people easily mistook that massive patience for deep uncertainty. They quickly labeled you as just still figuring it all out, simply because you absolutely did not loudly stage highly dramatic arrivals or aggressively rush to quickly post a loud victory lap. In absolute truth, every single highly slow day, every single apparent quiet detour, every single seemingly boring routine task was absolutely part of a highly detailed ledger that strictly only you could accurately read. A powerful ledger where highly tiny, deeply disciplined entries steadily added up to something entirely irreversible. The massive difference between cheap spectacle and deep substance is simply perfect timing. Cheap spectacle always aggressively demands massive attention right now and loudly asks the whole world to actively witness its fake rise. True substance vastly prefers the deeply long view. You heavily invested entirely in the latter. You strictly allowed the hard work to loudly speak much later, absolutely not because you deeply feared public recognition, but entirely because you fully understood the truly unstoppable power of massive accumulation. Highly small, strict habits, consistently repeated completely without any cheap fanfare, actively created a massive momentum that loud public noise absolutely could never possibly match. While absolutely everyone else desperately searched for easy shortcuts and cheap applause, you strictly practiced the incredibly quiet, deep arithmetic of actual true progress. Massive results absolutely do not always look highly glamorous while they are actively being heavily made. And that deep ambiguity perfectly kept you highly invisible just long enough to finally finish the massive job. There is absolutely also massive hidden strength entirely in the simple appearance of deep incompletion. When foolish people strictly assume you are highly primitive or heavily unfinished, they eagerly lean in with incredibly low, cheap expectations. They rapidly reveal their hidden strategies. They quickly misplace their actual priorities. They entirely fail to aggressively guard against a massive force they absolutely do not see coming. You brilliantly use that massive misjudgment exactly like a highly powerful margin of absolute safety. You absolutely did not owe them any cheap proof. You strictly owed yourself massive patience and deep precision. You actively showed up to quickly tackle the exact heavy tasks that absolutely no one else ever wanted to do. The highly boring edits, the late calls at incredibly odd hours, the heavy, exhausting practice when absolutely no one was actively watching. Those highly unpaid, quiet hours are exactly where massive reliability and deep true skill actively compound. When the exact right moment finally arrived, you absolutely did not desperately surge forward. You completely stepped right into the exact massive position you had completely quietly prepared for. That is exactly the absolute cruelest heavy lesson for them. They were completely ready to aggressively fight yesterday's highly outdated version of you. They had heavily rehearsed their cheap defenses entirely for loud noise, for fake posturing, and for massive drama. They absolutely had not rehearsed anything at all for someone whose immense power was entirely a massive consequence of a highly steady, incredibly deliberate deep craft. By that exact time, any cheap interference would be incredibly late, highly clumsy, and entirely ineffective. Actively disguising immense power entirely as slow process is absolutely not cheap deception. It is highly brilliant strategy. It is aggressively refusing to ever cheaply trade deep true mastery for highly momentary fake recognition. It is completely choosing to actively build a massive foundation, incredibly strong enough that when true visibility finally fully arrives, your massive heavy impact is absolutely not just a highly quick flash. It actively becomes an entirely new massive floor that absolutely everyone else must now desperately climb just to barely keep up. Number 14. Their ignorance was your protection. Their massive ignorance was absolutely never an accident. It was highly divine protection. The simple fact that they absolutely never saw you coming was absolutely not because you were totally invisible, but strictly because they were deliberately kept entirely blind at the exact right time. You can absolutely call it highly divine timing. You can call it deep providence. You can call it the absolute natural true order of things. Either way you look at it, their complete massive inability to fully recognize exactly who you truly were was the absolute very heavy shield that fiercely guarded your massive rise. If they had completely seen the absolute fullness of your massive power entirely before you were totally ready, they absolutely would have violently attacked you exactly at your most highly fragile stage. They absolutely would have aggressively sabotaged, heavily slandered, and completely dismantled you entirely before your deep roots had sunk incredibly deep enough to firmly withstand the massive storm. That massive heavy blindness was exactly the strict delay you deeply needed to quickly become entirely unshakable. Think very deeply about it. Vicious predators absolutely do not patiently wait for massive strength to fully mature. They aggressively try to quickly kill the tiny seed. But the fragile seed actively carries its absolute, most highly precious massive transformation entirely in the deep pitch dark, heavily buried beneath the thick soil where absolutely no highly toxic eye can ever actively interfere. That is precisely exactly what quickly happened with you. Their massive heavy arrogance, their highly quick dismissal, their incredibly shallow judgments, absolutely all of it actively worked completely in your immense favor. By heavily underestimating you so deeply, they strictly left you entirely untouched, just long enough to vastly grow entirely past their incredibly limited reach. Their massive heavy ignorance completely became your strict safe house, your highly invisible, massive fortress, your absolute cover exactly while all the highly real heavy work was actively happening. It was absolutely never a tiny weakness that kept you highly hidden. It was massive deep wisdom. If they had finally recognized you entirely too soon, you absolutely would have been violently exposed to massive heavy battles you were absolutely not meant to fight quite yet. You actively would have completely wasted highly precious massive energy, aggressively defending a massive deep destiny that was entirely still heavily under construction. Their massive deep ignorance meant you could strongly channel all your heavy effort entirely deeply inward, entirely into massive preparation, deep learning, heavy resilience, and crystal clarity, absolutely instead of aggressively outward into highly pointless, toxic wars. Exactly what they absolutely did not know perfectly kept you entirely whole. By the exact time the massive heavy unveiling finally completely arrived, it was vastly too late for them to ever quickly undo it. By the exact time their shallow eyes finally adjusted, By the exact time they fully realized exactly who had been standing right in front of them the entire time, your massive, heavy foundation was completely reinforced. Toxic attacks could actively come, but they would instantly bounce completely off a massive, heavy armor that was violently forged entirely in deep silence. Cheap attempts to aggressively sabotage entirely failed, simply because the massive structure had completely hardened entirely beyond any total collapse. Their massive ignorance, which absolutely once looked exactly like a highly cheap insult, was absolutely in actual fact a massive heavy shield, perfectly designed entirely for your complete survival. That is exactly the massive, profound irony of absolutely all of it. The exact massive heavy blindness they so loudly laughed about, the exact massive arrogance that aggressively made them entirely dismiss you, was absolutely the exact divine hand of complete protection, heavily shaping your massive path. Their massive, deep ignorance absolutely did not just tightly protect you, it perfectly positioned you. When you absolutely finally confidently stepped right into full clear view, you absolutely were not highly vulnerable at all. You were completely untouched and entirely untouchable. In the absolute total end, the true profound story of the chosen ones is absolutely never about being totally invisible or highly magically lucky. It is entirely about massive, brilliant strategy, deep, heavy patience, and completely quiet, true mastery. Every single heavy detour, every single quiet pause, every single highly ordinary moment was absolutely never a tiny weakness, but a massive, heavy shield. While the entire shallow world frantically chased loud noise, cheap, massive spectacle, and highly predictable, boring markers of fake power, you quietly moved exactly with massive, deadly precision, brilliantly disguised immense true strength entirely as a highly slow process, and smoothly let your highly ordinary raw humanity completely cloak the massive raging fire deep inside you. They massively misjudged you completely at absolutely every single sharp turn, simply because they were heavily trained to strictly see only cheap, highly shallow mirrors of their own exact toxic selves. They foolishly mistook heavy divine detours entirely for highly crushing defeats, massive calculated silence completely for sad, weak surrender, and highly beautiful ordinariness entirely for massive, boring insignificance. Yet absolutely every single massive miscalculation they actively made was just another thick, heavy layer of absolute protection you absolutely never even had to quickly ask for. By quietly hiding right in completely plain sight, you rapidly became entirely, totally untouchable, completely without ever quickly raising a single tiny alarm. You heavily built massive, profound depth exactly where they strictly expected cheap shallowness, highly unbreakable resilience, exactly where they strictly saw total fragility and massively unstoppable true power, exactly where they foolishly assumed deep tiny weakness. Their massive complete blindness, total heavy arrogance, and massive terrible misreading of your highly profound journey were absolutely never massive toxic setbacks. They were strictly the exact massive necessary scaffolding of your completely unstoppable massive rise. Now, exactly when your massive, powerful presence finally quickly becomes completely, absolutely undeniable, it will violently feel entirely highly sudden to them. If this deep, profound message heavily spoke directly to your deep, powerful soul, absolutely do not simply keep it entirely just to yourself. Quickly subscribe exactly to the channel right now so you absolutely never easily miss the exact next massive, profound revelation. Quickly, gently like the video to visibly show your deep, massive support. Easily comment directly below and freely share your highly deep thoughts or highly personal, profound experiences. Quickly, eagerly share it directly with absolutely anyone who deeply, strictly needs to clearly, highly see the immense, massive hidden power right inside themselves. Absolutely every single tiny action heavily helps us actively build a massive, powerful community entirely of exact people who clearly, truly recognize massive raw strength, deep, heavy patience, and brilliant, massive strategy, quietly hiding exactly right in completely plain sight. Your powerful true voice absolutely strictly matters exactly in that massive, heavy movement. May God richly, completely bless you. Amen.